Hello, and welcome to the History of Rome, Episode 96, The Most Aptly Named Emperor. The mildness of Marcus, which the rigid discipline of the Stoics had been unable to eradicate, formed at the same time the most amiable and the only defective part of his character. His excellent understanding was often deceived by the unsuspecting goodness in his heart. So begins Chapter 4 of Edward Gibbon's Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, also known as the chapter where it starts to get really good and isn't quite so super boring anymore. Marcus, suffering from the defect of excessive kind-heartedness, had sealed his legacy as the last good princeps by entrusting the empire to his son, whose legacy everyone agrees is that he was one of the worst emperors of all time. But Gibbon himself is not quite as harsh on Commodus as you might think. In Gibbon's estimation, Commodus's failure was not that he was cruel or bloodthirsty or evil, but simply that he was weak. Ascending to the throne at the age of 19 in March of 180 AD, Commodus naturally fell under the sway of older, savvier men who manipulated the young prince into satisfying their own ambitions. Once he had spent a few years as a mere puppet, the dark habits of his advisors simply ingrained themselves onto his character, and from then on, the weakness of his soul became indistinguishable from the cruelty that manifested as a result. In the end, though, he seemed to have learned his lessons a little too well, and he turned out to be far savvier and far crueler than any of his advisors, and he was only caught out and killed after a good 3 or 4 complete and bloody turnovers of personnel within his inner circle. That's Gibbon's assessment anyway. Others are not quite so quick to let Commodus off the hook. They see in him from the get-go a self-absorbed hedonist who was intellectually vacant, obsessed with sport, and likely a sociopath to boot. He was Lucius Verus without any Marcus Aurelius to keep him in check. He was Nero and Caligula combined, topping both in scandal, debauchery, and murderous frivolity. Still others, though, loved Commodus, and, at least for the majority of his reign, thought he was the absolute bee's knees. Now, what group of compulsive contrarians would take such a contradictory line on a man so universally reviled by history? Why, the people of Rome, of course. The story of the reign of Commodus, and like the story of the reign of Domitian, was chronicled by the Roman aristocracy, and they, to a man, loathed him and everything he ever did. The general population never got a say in the way Roman history was written, so all the bits about how Commodus was, for a long time at least, a beloved figure, comes as something of a surprise to modern ears. But unlike Domitian, who comes by his bad rap somewhat, but not totally unfairly, Commodus, I think, earned his in spades. There was, for example, no underlying soundness of policy to go with the cruelty, no greater vision for the empire, beyond when the next set of games was going to be. And unlike Domitian's reign of terror, which, as I mentioned, was comparable to the political murders of dear old Uncle Claudius, Commodus went back to the well of blood time and time again in a purge and proscription cycle that came round every 3 to 5 years as men fell from favor and others rose to take their place. But if there was one thing that Commodus did really well, at least until the very end, it was keeping the people in the street eating out of his often extended hand. The people in the street didn't really care what senator Commodus was in the process of humiliating, or what governor he was in the process of assassinating. What they cared about, honestly, was games. And boy, did Commodus ever give them what they wanted. Polar opposite of Marcus and his few begrudging spectacles, Commodus embraced the games like no emperor before or since, and the people ate it up. By the end, though, he had driven the empire deep, deep into debt, and had gone so far off his rocker that even his previously adoring masses turned on him. But for the better part of a decade, we should always remember that his enemies were in the Senate, and just about nowhere else. Commodus made it plain from the very beginning that his reign was not going to be like that of his father's. Shipping the corpse of Marcus to Rome for burial and deification and etc., etc., Commodus stayed encamped along the Danube to finish what his father had started. And by that I mean just that, finish what his father had started. Despite the pleas of Claudius Pompeianus and the other leaders who had poured their blood and sweat into the German campaigns, Commodus announced his intention to wrap things up and head home. "But the work is undone," his father's old phalanx of lieutenants cried. "It will only take another year, and then we can all bask in the glory of having defeated the barbarians and added new territory to the empire, just as your father always wanted. It was practically his dying wish that you should lead us to victory." But Commodus was having none of it. He would come to final terms with the Marcomanni and Quadi, and then head back to Rome as soon as possible. There are two interpretations of why Commodus was so quick to withdraw from the Danube, and at least to a good chunk of his father's allies, simply vacate the meaning of 12 years' hard labor in the process. The first take is a high-minded one. Commodus saw himself playing Hadrian to his father's Trajan, that he saw the new German provinces would, rather than add wealth to the empire, prove to be militarily indefensible and become a dangerous drain on the treasury. Whatever romantic notions of victory Marcus had forged in the heat of battle, someone, namely Commodus, had to bring some objective, clear thinking to the situation, and the fact of the matter was, the whole campaign had probably been an unforgivable waste of men and money. To see it through to the end would not secure his father's legacy. It would damn it as an example of criminal overreach. But the other interpretation, and these two rationales are by no means mutually exclusive, is that Commodus had had it up to here with freezing to death in a plague-infested legionary camp. He was going back to Rome, where the baths were hot and the women were plentiful. What was the point of being emperor if you couldn't live like one? Not totally insensible to appearances, Commodus did decide to lead a force across the river one last time, where, after picking a suitably overmatched collection of Germans, he beat said overmatched collection of Germans soundly. This allowed the new emperor the necessary optical cover he needed to declare victory and leave. He came to terms with the grateful and utterly exhausted Quadi and Marcomanni, and in the autumn of 180 AD began the trip back to Rome. What we should make of this decision to leave is still open to debate, but it is worth mentioning that when the Romans called off the fight this time, the Germans took peace for an answer, and it proved to be more than 70 years before there was once again serious trouble north of the Danube. Commodus took the relative peace as proof of the wisdom of his actions, but it is also worth pointing out that the various German tribes had just had the snot kicked out of them for the better part of 12 years. Their leaders were all dead, and the ranks of their armies had been reduced by plague and war, even worse than the legions had been. If Commodus had pursued the same policy a decade earlier, the whole northern empire might have been overrun. But he didn't pursue the policy then. He was pursuing it now. And much as it irked the hawks in the Senate and among his own circle of imperial advisors, there was no great fallout to come from abandoning the war. In October 180, Commodus returned to Rome to begin the process of securing his rule. As you'll recall from last week's episode, Marcus had been very careful about making sure that there would be no pretenders to the throne when Commodus succeeded him, and in this he was entirely successful. None of his various brothers-in-law had any interest in challenging him, and no one else had the guts or support to pull a fast one on the empire, especially after the fall of Avidius Cassius. But that did not mean that there was not still work to be done. In securing their own positions, Marcus and Antoninus Pius had worked assiduously to curry favor within the senatorial class. But Commodus, as in all things where his father did one thing, he did the exact opposite. Commodus figured his rule would be unchallenged if he won the support of two groups, the soldiers in the field and the masses in the street. He had already earned the love of the common soldiers in the army by canceling the war in Germany. Soldiers, in general, love it when you tell them they don't have to slog around dank forests enduring guerrilla attacks anymore. So upon his return to Rome, Commodus set about earning the love of the people. This meant, first, issuing a generous donative to every male citizen in the city, and second, it meant throwing spectacular games to celebrate his ascension. Fat with cash and prizes, the people, needless to say, were in Commodus's pocket from day one. The Senate, meanwhile, looked on all of this with a mixture of hope and disdain. They knew Commodus's reputation and knew that he was still a teenager, but hoped that maybe one day, once he's done proving to everyone what a super wonderful guy he is, that he would get down to the serious business and work with the Senate to govern the empire responsibly. But their hope quickly faded, engulfed by the disdain. Because it wasn't just that Commodus planned to ignore the Senate. No, he was about to embark on a policy of openly antagonizing them. There doesn't seem to be any real rationale for Commodus's attitude towards the Senate, and his reasoning may not have been any deeper than that he had been born a high prince and was now the undisputed ruler of the Roman Empire. He was not, as Marcus and Antoninus had been, a member in good standing of the aristocratic Mutual Admiration Society, and probably figured that as long as he had the people and the armies on his side, that he could pretty much do whatever he wanted with the old fuddy-duddies in the Senate. And in a way, he was right. People asked during the 100th episode thread when the old Roman Senate stopped convening, and the answer is that we don't exactly know, but in the West, it looked like it persisted at least into the 600s AD. However, for all practical purposes, they could have closed up shop right now. Despite a few brief flirtations with relevance during the chaos of the mid-3rd century, the reign of Commodus marked the end of the line for the aristocratic assembly. The Severans had no time for the Senate. The crisis period was a running battle between rival generals, and then when Diocletian reformed the governmental structure of the empire to better reflect reality, the Senate was left out of the bargain completely. In this respect, Commodus did have a major hand in helping push the old Roman order off a cliff. Remember how worried Hadrian had been about having the blood of 4 senators on his hand? Or how proud Antoninus and Marcus had been that they had not executed any members of the Senate during their reign? That was all over. When 193 rolled around, the Senate was not just irrelevant, it had been transformed by execution, proscription, murder, and exile into an entirely different assembly than the one Commodus had inherited in 180. The Senate Septimius Severus inherited was not just ignorable, it was, after being packed with low-life supporters of Commodus, probably worth ignoring. At the outset, though, no one, probably not even Commodus himself, knew that that was the direction the young emperor was headed. For right now, anyway, Commodus didn't seem to have much interest in anything as boring or time-consuming as an epic purge of the Senate. He instead retired to the palace to enjoy the benefits of being emperor and turned over actual administration of the empire to his imperial chamberlain and sometimes male lover, a freedman named Septimius. The Senate was obviously scandalized that the emperor was handing power over to some freedman lover, male lover no less, and Septimius was universally despised in the upper classes. This hatred was only heightened when Septimius realized that the treasury could not support the promises Commodus had made to the people, and he hit upon the old idea of property confiscation to help pay for it all. In fits and starts at first, but then more routinely, senators would be accused of treason on trumped-up charges and wake up to find that their estates had been seized by the emperor. It was right around this time that all hope dissolved and the disdain fully took over, and also the fear. But it wouldn't be the Senate who took the first shot at Commodus, nor would that first shot be taken to strike a blow for liberty in the face of despotic tyranny. Commodus's sister Lucilla, by virtue of her long-dead marriage to Lucius Verus, still retained the title of Augusta, and since the death of Faustina in 175, had enjoyed the perks that came with being the preeminent woman of the empire. But now that her younger brother wore the purple, his pretty little thing of a wife Crispina suddenly supplanted Lucilla. Petty as it sounds, the most commonly relayed version of the story is that the final break came when Lucilla was forced to give up the prize box at the theater in favor of Crispina. From that moment on, it seems that Lucilla opened up a conspiracy to kill her little brother. She took into confidence her lover Marcus Quadratus and a few other particularly dissatisfied senators, though, importantly, not her husband Claudius Pompeianus, who Lucilla seems to have had no like or love for whatsoever, and a plot was hatched. As 181 gave way to 182, the plan hardened and the details were set. A young senator and nephew of Claudius Pompeianus, named Pompeius Quintanus, was enlisted to actually lay the killing stroke. And one night, as Commodus returned home from the theater, Quintanus was hiding in the shadowy porticos of the Colosseum. He leapt out of his hiding place as the imperial party passed, catching the emperor and his bodyguards by surprise. But rather than just killing the emperor, Quintanus added a little dramatic flourish, crying, "See, this is what the Senate sends you." This unnecessary hesitation allowed the startled Praetorians time to recover, tackle Quintanus, and wrestle him to the ground. Caught and tortured, the young assassin revealed the full details of the plot, and that the prime mover of the conspiracy had been none other than Lucilla. Quadratus and Quintanus were immediately executed, and Lucilla was exiled to the island of Capri. Once she had been out of sight and mind for a while, Commodus sent along the order to have her killed. But the attempt on Commodus's life had only been part of the plan. The other half of the plot actually succeeded, and with the help of the two Praetorian prefects, Satyrus turned up dead a few days later. Still reeling from his own brush with death, when Commodus learned that his favorite had been murdered, the emperor went into a frenzy. Just as the reign of Commodus was a turning point in the history of Rome, the assassination attempt of 182 was the turning point within the turning point. With the unnecessary and only partially true words, "This is what the Senate sends you," ringing in his ears, Commodus's attitude towards the Senate would take a homicidal turn for the worse. In the immediate aftermath of the botched plot, Claudius Pompeianus wisely retired from public life. Though he was not under suspicion, his wife and nephew had been prime movers in the attempt on the emperor's life. It was time for his long and distinguished career to come to an end. Typically in this situation, politicians cite the desire to spend more time with their families as the reason they are retiring, but obviously that would not have been the most prudent excuse given the circumstances, so Pompeianus cited, poor eyesight. Yeah, that's the ticket, instead. The rest of the fallout came when one of the Praetorian prefects, a ruthlessly ambitious equite named Tigidius Perennis, double-crossed his Praetorian colleague and everyone else he knew who was involved in the plot. Keeping his own role hidden, the information Perennis provided led to the executions of his Praetorian colleague, two of the consuls for the year, the Secretary of Correspondence, and the governor of Upper Germany, Salvius Julianus. Surviving with his head intact, but nonetheless removed from his post as the long-serving governor of Lower Germany, was Julianus's cousin Didius Julianus, who, those of you who are reading ahead, know that we'll have cause to deal with a little bit down the road. Also caught up in the purge were the famous Quintilius brothers, who had been key lieutenants of Marcus during the Marcomannic Wars, and who, as a reward, had shared a consulship together. His paranoia now raging unchecked, Commodus fired the innocent and highly capable governors Septimius Severus and Pertinax for their failure to capture one of the conspirators who had gotten out of Rome alive. We'll have cause to deal with both of them down the road as well. The purge then extended to all of his father's old advisors, and then to every legionary commander across the whole empire. Commodus fired every single one of them and replaced them with his own men. Back in Rome, anyone who raised the ire of the emperor, man, woman, or child, was likely to wind up murdered and their estates confiscated. All in all, the failed assassination attempt led the empire into the bloodiest round of purges since the end of Domitian's reign. But really, not since the old days of Tiberius and Sejanus had the aristocracy lived with such a cloud of fear hanging over their heads. Playing the part of Sejanus to Commodus's Tiberius was the arch-Machiavellian Perennis, who had parlayed his insider information he had because he was, totally in on the plot to kill Commodus, into the position of the emperor's right-hand man. Commodus handed over the day-to-day operations of the empire to Perennis, and for the next 3 years, while the emperor himself engaged in every debauched activity you think of when you think of debauched Roman aristocrats, Tigidius Perennis was the man in charge. When Commodus did climb down into the real world of politics, it was mostly to humiliate some senator or rearrange the provincial postings to keep everyone on their toes. Beginning during this period, but not perfected until the fall of Perennis and the rise of Cleander, who had recently been made chamberlain to replace the assassinated Satyrus, was the regular sale of office and the constant shuffling of office holders. Perennis and Commodus were, in a way, engaged in a friendly rivalry to see who could create the most political and bureaucratic chaos so that the dust would keep swirling and they themselves would remain safely cocooned in the center of the storm. Consulships were bought and sold, praetorian prefects were appointed and fired sometimes within the span of days, governors were sent out to provinces and learned that they had been replaced when they arrived at their new posting. And, most important of all, membership in the Senate was open to anyone who Commodus favored, or, perhaps more importantly, who the emperor thought the old senators would hate. The empire was lucky during this chaotic period for two reasons. First, the borders were relatively peaceful. The two groups who would have posed the biggest threat to the empire were the Parthians and the Germans, and they had both been recently humbled by massive defeat at the hands of the legions, and were not looking to make trouble again anytime soon. So even though Rome had become politically schizophrenic, no foreign enemy was ready to take advantage of the empire's madness. Second, though he was personally ruthless, Perennis was no administrative slouch. He kept the grain flowing, the books balanced, and the games running. It all would have fallen apart much sooner had he been utterly corrupt or a dismal accountant, but he was neither, and so the empire, while not exactly flourishing, was not yet to be driven into the ground. But discontentment was stirring. In 183, a brief war in Dacia broke out that was put down by a combined effort of the final two of the five would-be emperors in the fast-approaching year of the five emperors, Claudius Albinus and Pescennius Niger. The other three being the aforementioned Pertinax, Didius Julianus, and Septimius Severus. The next year, unrest in Britain led the commander there to press north and retake the Antonine Wall, which had been abandoned around the time of Marcus's ascension. The general in question, though, was a harsh disciplinarian who the regular troops hated, and following the campaign, they revolted against his leadership and proclaimed another commander emperor. This commander wisely refused the honor and got the troops back under control for the moment, but the next year, rebellion among the British legions flared up once again. This time, their ire was directed at Perennis himself, who they blamed for being late with equipment, stingy with pay, and saddling them with harsh masters who would not indulge the lax atmosphere they had come to expect. In a sign of things to come, that is, the failure of discipline that would soon become an epidemic in the legions, a deputation of 1,500 armed soldiers marched out of Britain for Rome, where they planned to present their grievances to the emperor in person. Missing the greater point of the precedent he was endorsing, Commodus allowed the rogue company to enter Italy and march on Rome armed to the teeth. Hearing the news that this force from Britain was on the way, the imperial chamberlain Cleander saw the perfect opportunity to make his own Machiavellian strike. With the help of some dissatisfied senators, Cleander set about trumping up charges against Perennis that seemed to show he was aiming to make either himself or his son emperor at some point in the not-too-distant future. When the soldiers from Britain arrived to present their case, Perennis was confident that he would be able to dispatch them with ease, but at the same moment, Cleander was presenting Commodus with the allegation that Perennis was planning on overthrowing him. Having hit the emperor's paranoid center right where it hurt, Commodus suddenly turned on the blindsided Perennis and ordered his former favorite and his entire family executed. Cleander then dutifully led the emperor through the list of senators who were involved in the trumped-up plot. Conveniently, they were all personal enemies of Cleander. And the aristocracy was once again caught up in a bloody purge, already the second of Commodus's short reign. The fall of Perennis would send the empire off a cliff, because while the old Praetorian prefect had been a capable administrator, his replacement as imperial favorite Cleander was nothing of the sort. Next week, the wheels will come off the bus. The art of creating bureaucratic chaos for fun and profit will be perfected by Cleander, who will run the empire, if you could even call it that, for 5 years, while Commodus drifted further off into his own private fantasy land. Cleander will finally be eaten by the monster he creates, and Commodus, now nearing his 30s, will be forced to step in and actually do some real governing. But by this time, he was convinced not only that he was the reincarnation of Hercules, but also that he was the greatest gladiator who ever lived, so it's not like he brought a lot of stability to the situation. Like Domitian before him, Commodus would eventually be done in by members of his own inner circle, who were worried that they were about to be caught up in yet another round of purges. His assassination on New Year's Eve 192 will spark the first great domestic crisis since the year of the four emperors, and 193 AD will go down in history with a nice little nod to inflation as the year of the 5 emperors. Hello, and welcome to the History of Rome, Episode 97, The Fall of Hercules. Okay, so last time, Maximus was totally framed by Joaquin Phoenix, and even though he was able to escape his own execution and make it back to his estates in Spain, the fugitive general was eventually captured by slave traders, but not before learning that Joaquin Phoenix had murdered his entire family. This week, now a gladiator, Maximus must fight or die in the arena, and maybe, hopefully, one day have his revenge. Okay, not really. There was no Maximus. The non-existent Maximus did not kill Commodus in single combat, and that certainly did not lead to a great restoration of the Republic. Good movie, though. And, funny enough, the bit about Commodus fighting as a gladiator was no joke, and if anything, the movie actually downplayed the Emperor's obsession. Following the purges that surrounded the fall of Perennis, the imperial chamberlain Cleander rose to power, and along with a circle of corrupt and decadent allies, Cleander ran the empire for his own benefit from 185 to 190 AD. During those years, Commodus withdrew even further from the real world, and when not drinking or dabbling in his harem or sitting in the baths, he spent the majority of his free time training to be a gladiator. The emperor's obsession with gladiatorial combat dated back to his childhood and was the centerpiece of that reputation I talked about earlier, the one Marcus hoped Commodus would eventually outgrow. But rather than outgrow it, Commodus let it grow with him. Disinterested in the real work of soldiering, Commodus was fascinated with the staged fights of the arena, and from very early on aspired to join the pantheon of gladiatorial gods. Now an emperor, and with no one to stop him, he let this ambition off its leash. Now, in the Roman social hierarchy, an emperor was at the very tippy-top of the pyramid, and a gladiator was in the sub-basement, down with the prostitutes and the actors. A free citizen fighting in the arena was unseemly. An equite fighting was scandalous. A senator fighting was a barely conceivable horror. An emperor fighting as a gladiator? Well, that would be the equivalent of the president turning up one morning in a crack den. Commodus cared not a whit about the social taboos, though. He wanted to stand over 10,000 dead opponents and bask in the adoration of the crowd. Nothing else mattered. At first, he confined himself to private contests, but as he grew more confident in his abilities, the emperor started naming himself the headline attraction for the all-too-frequent games thrown during his reign. Now, Commodus was no slouch here. He was young and athletic, and seems to have taken his training seriously. He was an excellent shot and handy with every kind of weapon imaginable. But there's no getting around the fact that he never did fight a fair fight. Obviously, you can't have the emperor going out there and getting killed by some random slave, so Commodus typically fought pre-wounded opponents, or, more commonly, opponents who had been given a lead sword to match up against the emperor's sharpened steel. These widely known secrets of the emperor's success made all his boasting about what a great warrior he was ring a bit hollow, and far from elevating his reputation, it made him the object of persistent, if private, mockery. Adding a malevolent edge to his somewhat ridiculous displays of alleged gladiatorial prowess was the fact that Commodus took particular delight in killing anything that seemed freakish. He would bring in midgets so he could pretend to be a mighty giant. He would bring in amputees and watch them hobble around feebly as he toyed with them. And at times, he would put his surgical skills to the test and slowly dismember victims while avoiding major arteries. His most famous routine, though, was the hunt, and in addition to the old recurring line about having slain 100 lions in a single day, he was fond of bringing in exotic oddities, ostriches, giraffes, elephants, and the like, and felling them with a few well-placed arrows. For a long time, the masses got a kick out of the ludicrous novelty of watching the emperor do horrible things to handicapped opponents, but the novelty eventually wore off. For members of the Senate, meanwhile, at least the non-Commodus appointed members of the Senate anyway, there never was any novelty to begin with. The whole spectacle was an affront to the dignity of the emperor, the senators themselves, and the empire at large. Commodus suspected that if given a chance, his friends and colleagues in the Senate would find other places to be on game day, so he made attendance at his performances mandatory. That is, one of the quickest ways to find yourself on the emperor's hit list was to call in sick to the Colosseum. And when you found yourself on the emperor's hit list, it wasn't like he just didn't invite you to dinner or something. No, that meant that charges of treason, property confiscation, and execution were right around the corner. So the senators went and watched the emperor club cripples to death. Really, the whole thing was just cruel, pathetic, and sad. Meanwhile, the empire continued to plunge unchecked towards a system-wide failure. The legions upon whom Commodus was in part resting the legitimacy of his reign were beginning to slip away from him. At first, their ire was directed at the emperor's favorites like Perennis, but as their dissatisfaction mounted, Commodus began to become an object of their anger as well. Commodus had dispatched Pertinax to Britain, which had been a recent hotbed of insubordination, with instructions to get the situation there back in hand. Pertinax was an old soldier who had earned his name and reputation putting out Rome's fires across the empire, and when he got to Britain, it did not take long for him to be embraced by the heretofore rebellious troops. But at this point in the history of the empire, being embraced by the troops was a dangerous proposition. So when the British legions got together and decided to hail Pertinax their new emperor, Pertinax outright refused. Deeply unsettled by the position he found himself in, he wrote to Commodus requesting immediate reassignment. Now, you would think the fact that the British legions kept trying to declare new emperors would have led to some sort of imperial action. But apparently, Commodus, and at this point Cleander, vastly underestimated the severity of the situation. Soon enough, though, they would no longer be able to ignore it. In 186, a charismatic army deserter in Gaul named Maternus began to round up a motley crew of followers, consisting of fellow deserters, ex-soldiers, and brigands. At first, they were concerned mostly with raiding the countryside for their own enrichment, but eventually, after more and more men flocked to his banner, Maternus began to think of himself as the second coming of Spartacus. His force grew to the point that raids on towns turned into sieges of small cities. He led his men back and forth across the Pyrenees, causing havoc in the under-garrisoned portions of Spain and Gaul, before finally the powers that be realized that there was a renegade army running loose within the empire. The response to this brief uprising, sometimes called the Deserters' War, was spearheaded by Pescennius Niger, who was finally able to confront Maternus's force and defeat it in open battle. But, undeterred, in March of 187, Maternus regrouped with a corps of supporters and headed south into Italy. The plan now was to infiltrate Rome during an upcoming festival, get close to the emperor and assassinate him. The plot was not as outlandish as it sounds. The festival involves citizens of every class putting on costumes and partying in the streets. Maternus managed to secure some Praetorian Guard uniforms and figured that with everyone, including the guard, getting good and drunk in an atmosphere of shifting identities, that he might just be able to bluff his way into the imperial entourage. But before the conspiracy got off the ground, Maternus was betrayed by one of his followers over some personal slight, and the assassins were all rounded up and executed. The already paranoid Commodus was driven further round the bend by the revelation that his life had been saved not by the fact that his bodyguards were so super great at their jobs, but because the conspiracy had been betrayed by a disgruntled ex-member. Further compounding his agitation was a note passed along by Pertinax that one of Commodus's brothers-in-law and a few other senators were gathering support for their own assassination attempt. It seems that Pertinax thought the chances of the conspirators dim, and so decided to make double sure that he wasn't implicated in the plot, and alerted the emperor after he himself was invited to join. From this point on, Commodus was rendered practically inert. He never left the safe confines of the palace, or, if he wasn't in Rome, the safety of his country villas. The only public appearances he made for the rest of his reign were when he performed as a gladiator, seemingly the only time that he actually felt safe and comfortable. But though Commodus was a publicly invisible emperor, he was still a force to be reckoned with in private, and not in a good way at all. With Perennis as his colleague, Commodus had taken a shine to debasing the Senate, making erratic bureaucratic appointments, and doing whatever he could to personally humiliate individual members of the aristocracy. But now, with Cleander as his partner in crime, everything was ratcheted up a couple of notches. Cleander made a fortune selling offices, membership in the Senate, and plum overseas appointments, while Commodus encouraged his freedmen to harass senators, confiscate their property, and, when the mood struck him, murder them. Further compounding the mockery they were making of the government was the fact that the two men actually spent very little time thinking about the government, and chose instead to focus on exploring the vast and wide depths of sexual depravity. I won't go into the details because, hey, this is a family podcast, but suffice it to say that there was some pretty brutal stuff going on at the palace, and not at all behind closed doors. In mid-187, Cleander took the lead in a new round of purges, this one aimed at anyone connected to the conspiracy Pertinax had decided to expose. Luckily for Cleander, the families involved were also personal enemies, who represented the last real organized threat to his power. So, off with all their heads. This latest round of political murders is further notable for sweeping up the Empress Crispina along with everyone else. It doesn't look like she was in any way involved in the plot, but rather that she simply fell victim to the whims of a probably sociopathic emperor who had grown tired of his wife. Bad enough that she was exiled and then killed, but her crime, the one so heinous that she was exiled and killed for it, was simply being caught up engaging in an extramarital affair. You know, the kind her husband had engaged in every single day of their marriage. Stay classy, Commodus. In 188, Cleander further solidified his grip on power by creating a new office that superseded the two Praetorian prefects, effectively putting him in charge of the emperor's secret police. Up to this point, Cleander had controlled the guard much as Perennis had, by constantly hiring and firing the prefects so none of them could create enduring loyalty within the ranks. But having finally set the record by allowing one poor appointee to remain in office a mere 6 hours, Cleander finally decided that this was maybe getting a little ridiculous, that there needed to be some kind of institutional stability. What if the guard actually needed to do something? So he invented a new office, assumed it, and then ran the Praetorians himself. At this point, it seemed like things would go on like this forever. Cleander had a stranglehold on Rome, the enemies of the new imperial order were all dead or exiled, and Commodus cared only about chariot racing, sitting in the baths, and gladiatorial combat. The empire was slowly being driven into the ground, but anyone in a position to actually do anything about it were the ones already behind the wheel and doing said driving. But as so often happens in these sorts of bloodily tyrannical quasi-police states, one minute you're up, and the next minute you're being airbrushed out of that photo of you and Stalin enjoying a nice glass of vodka together. For Cleander, the end came in 190, a year in which he and Commodus conspired to appoint 25 different men consul, a record that would stand unchallenged for the rest of the life of the empire. Remember when consulships were a sacred office that marked the prestigious climax of a long and distinguished career? Yeah, no one else does either. Included in that infamously long roll call of consuls for 190, though, was a man who was about to reach the new climax point for the Roman politician, Septimius Severus. In one of those classic "it's the economy stupid" moments, Cleander's fall from power was precipitated by a grain shortage in Rome. Without a major crisis getting in his way, Cleander was able to more or less come and go as he pleased. But as soon as the grain stopped flowing, and someone needed to be scapegoated, well, that someone was naturally the man who had just spent 5 years lording over everyone how much power he had. The few active enemies of the imperial chamberlain left alive seized the opportunity the food shortages presented and organized a very public display against the emperor's favorite at the one place the emperor was bound to hear about it, in the Circus Maximus. In April of 190 AD, at a set of chariot races, a group of children were given anti-Cleander banners and were snuck down onto the field, where they began shouting anti-Cleander chants. The hope was that if children were used, that the Praetorians wouldn't be able to just march out and club them all to death, and the trick seems to have worked. The crowd eventually joined in the chanting, and before too long they had worked themselves into a frenzy and marched out of the Circus Maximus towards the villa Cleander was staying at. Facing down a crowd of nearly 150,000, Cleander ordered the Praetorian Guard to move in and beat the mob into submission. But when he called for backup from the urban cohorts, who were at this point led by newly appointed urban prefect Pertinax, Pertinax not only ignored the call, but he ordered his own troops into the crowd to help them drive off the Praetorians. Cleander fled to the imperial villa Commodus was relaxing at, but as with Perennis, the emperor was more than willing to throw his favorite under the bus if that seemed like the safest course of action for Commodus. So rather than face the wrath of the mob himself, Cleander was handed over to the crowd, who promptly killed him and dragged his body through the streets. The fall of Cleander was accompanied by yet another round of purges, and anyone with a close connection to the dead chamberlain found themselves added to the emperor's prescription list rather than being asked to help draw them up. These are the times when you start to understand the appeal of a philosophy like Epicureanism, with its emphasis on leaving politics to those cruel enough and dumb enough to get caught up in it. During the reign of Commodus, you were either up and orchestrating the murder of your enemies, or you were down and being murdered by your enemies. Those leaders who survived to see the other side were either like Pertinax and willing to follow the winds wherever they blew, personal honor be damned, or like Septimius Severus, who kept his head down, but in witnessing the petty, bloody back and forth in Rome, developed an entirely cynical philosophy of government that would help transform the empire into the unstable, banana republic-style military dictatorships of the 3rd century. But before we get to the founding of the new Severan dynasty, we still have to cover the last ignoble phase of the Nervan Antonine dynasty. The unbroken line of high-quality emperors that stretch back nearly a century and produce some of the most recognizable names in Roman imperial history, Trajan, Hadrian, Marcus Aurelius, was about to be broken. Just as Nero had wrecked the Julio-Claudians and Domitian had wrecked the Flavians, Commodus was about to wreck the Antonines. In defense of the first two, The legitimacy of the Julio-Claudians was already a shaky proposition by the time Nero arrived, and Domitian was toppled not for being a terrible emperor, but for being an unusually arrogant one. Commodus, on the other hand, took an entirely healthy dynasty, spun a hard right, and just drove it into a brick wall. He was arrogant like Domitian, but instead of offsetting this by establishing an effective autocracy, he oversaw sloppy, corrupt, and decadent administration that bankrupted the empire, left its infrastructure to rot, and purged out most of its talented leaders. Commodus saved the best for last, though, and during his last 2 years in office, he really kicked the crazy up a notch. Basically, if Commodus had had his way, this podcast would not be called The History of Rome. It would be called The History of Commodiana. And I wouldn't be talking about how the Romans kicked off this or that campaign season in the month of April, but instead talking about how the Commodians kicked off this or that new campaign season in the month of Commodus. And also, did you know that Commodus was the reincarnation of Hercules? Not just that he liked to associate himself with Hercules, mind you, but that he was literally the reincarnation of Hercules? Yes, good times were ahead. The crazy really got rolling right after Cleander and his allies were liquidated. Rather than elevate some new favorite to power, the now 29-year-old Commodus decided that it was time to rule in his own right. He still surrounded himself with corrupt sycophants, most notably his mistress Marcia, new chamberlain Eclectus, and new praetorian prefect Quintus Letus. But unlike in his past dealings with Satyrus, Perennis, and Cleander, Commodus did not delegate his imperial responsibilities. But then again, neither did he really embrace them either. Instead, the governance of the empire was just sort of set adrift. Commodus spent nearly every day fighting as a gladiator, or enjoying the races, and his only real concern was making sure that he had enough money to pay for it all, usually by confiscating property or levying new taxes. But of course, he never did have enough money to pay for it all, and he would leave the imperial treasury deep, deep in the red. By 191, Commodus was beginning to lose touch even with the masses, who had always supported an emperor as obsessed with the games as they were. They began to look sideways at his obsession with Hercules, and took as mighty impious the claim that he was actually the reincarnation of the old Greek hero. When Commodus began erecting statues across the city featuring himself dressed as Hercules, and began carrying around a great big club, which he called the Club of Hercules, the people joined in the aristocracy's concern over the sanity of their emperor. Delusions of lineage aside, Commodus's association with Hercules did introduce a new theme to the political order that in time would become a staple of imperial propaganda. As we all know, Hercules was the son of Jupiter. This meant that if Commodus was literally an incarnation of Hercules, that his true father was not Marcus Aurelius, but Jupiter himself. Commodus further implied that this meant that he did not rule by virtue of the Senate's consent or the will of the masses, or because he had the backing of the legions, but because it was the will of his father, Jupiter, greatest and best. Commodus was, in other words, a divine monarch, and he himself was a living god. It would take a little while for this new conception of where imperial sovereignty lay to catch on, but Diocletian would eventually make the business about being a divine monarch a cornerstone of his empire-wide reforms. Now, of course, unlike Commodus, Diocletian probably did not actually believe that he was divine, and that he was simply grasping for anything that would help restore the dignity of the imperial throne so he could reassert some control over the legions. But still, that was where political theory was headed, and Commodus, at least in this one respect, was an innovator ahead of his time. But if he was a divinely appointed ruler, then it did not take long for Jupiter to realize his mistake. In 191, a fire broke out in Rome that raged for days, and among other things, burned the temple of the Vestas to the ground. Commodus seemed unconcerned about the damage, but rather seemed thrilled at the prospect of getting to refound Rome in his own image. So, In early 192, he fully embraced his own outsized megalomania and declared that henceforth Rome would no longer be called Rome, but instead the Colonia Aelia Commodiana. In other words, the city of Commodus. He further decreed that the legions would now be called the Commodiani, and the Senate would be called Commodus's Fortunate Senate, a sort of darkly comic rebranding. Having already changed his full name to Lucius Aelius Aurelius Commodus Augustus Hercules Romanus ex Superatoris Amazonius Invictus Felix Pius. He then changed the names of the months so that each lined up with one of his 12 corresponding names. All of this began to worry even his inner circle, who tried to dissuade the emperor from indulging himself too much in these fantasies, for fear that he would alienate the whole population with his strange declarations. But all that they got in response was a suspicious snarl, leaving them all with the justified true belief that they were about to be purged for having the temerity to question the Son of God. In late 192, Eclectus, Marcia, and Letus got together and agreed that the emperor had to be done away with, or they would all lose their heads, either at the hands of the emperor or at the hands of the mob, who seemed to be prepping for a mass uprising. But having seen multiple attempts on the emperor's life fail, they laid their plans carefully. Being so close to the emperor, they knew they would have the means, motive, and opportunity to do the job, but what they didn't yet have was someone willing to replace Commodus on the throne. Killing the emperor was one thing. Ensuring that the assassination would not cause a civil war was quite another. So they had to find someone who would be palatable to all three interested parties in the outcome: the Senate, the army, and the masses. In the end, they figured there was only one man for the job, and that was Pertinax. I'm not entirely sure why they thought Pertinax would do anything but just rat them out, but the conspirators approached the old general, and this time he concurred that Commodus's time was up. Pertinax agreed to wait in the wings and take no direct part in the killing, but when the deed was done, he pledged that when asked, he would reluctantly agree to don the purple. Even with their plans carefully laid, things got off to a bad start. On New Year's Eve 192, Marcia attempted to poison her lover, but Commodus caught wise to the poison and forced himself to vomit it all back up. Not sure who was behind the attempt, Commodus retired to his private bath so he could be alone with his paranoia. Quickly switching to Plan B, the conspirators sent Commodus's wrestling partner Narcissus into the bath with instructions to strangle the emperor. Just as with the assassination of Domitian, Commodus did not go quietly, but eventually Narcissus got the upper hand and Commodus lay dead on the floor. He was 31 years old and had ruled the empire very, very badly for 12 years. Next week, the empire will wake up with a massive hangover and try to take stock of the damage that had been done over the previous decade by Commodus and his friends. But before they could even find the aspirin, the people of Rome will be forced to endure a political situation spinning violently out of control. Pertinax will not last 100 days in power. The reign of his successor, Didius Julianus, will be even shorter. Then three men, representing different regions of the empire, will all vie for the throne on the battlefield. Rather than emerging into the safety of a Commodus-free world, the empire will instead find itself sucked into something far more treacherous: a year with 5 emperors. Hello, and welcome to the History of Rome, Episode 98, Purchasing Power. After numerous failed attempts, foiled plots, and exposed conspiracies, someone finally managed to kill Commodus. That someone was a young athlete named Narcissus, who had been promised a huge reward by the emperor's inner circle if he successfully strangled Commodus to death. With the deed done and finally done right, Phase 2 of the plan was then initiated. One of the key conspirators, Praetorian Prefect Quintus Letus, went and retrieved Publius Helvius Pertinax, who had been pacing around his house all night, waiting for either the good news that the emperor was dead, or the bad news that the plot had failed, and it was time to get caught up in the never-ending cycle of purges. When the knock on the door finally came, it was Letus announcing that the emperor was in fact dead, and Phase 2 was at hand. Phase 2 was hustling Pertinax to the Praetorian camp, where Letus had arranged for the old senator to be immediately proclaimed emperor. The troops were told that Commodus had died of an embolism, that Pertinax was already the consensus choice to succeed him, and that it was up to the rank-and-file Praetorians to make it official. They were uneasy about all of this, and were probably one of the few groups in the empire ready to shed tears for Commodus, but Letus promised them the world if they backed Pertinax, and so they did. The point of all of this was to present the Senate with a fait accompli, so that when the senators awakened on New Year's Day and found the old emperor dead, a new one would already be in place. All night, the conspirators fretted over how the Senate would react, but they were worried over nothing. Most of the Senate, after finally being convinced that this wasn't one of the hilarious emperor's practical jokes, were thrilled at the news that mad as a hatter Commodus was dead, and that Pertinax, wise, capable, and experienced Pertinax, was the man the Praetorians were demanding they accept as the new emperor. The choice of Pertinax was ratified immediately, and in almost the same breath, the memory of Commodus was officially damned. All his crazy pronouncements about renaming Rome and the months and the legions, those were all nullified, and across the city his statues were toppled. At the dawn of a new year, a new day was dawning for the empire. Kind of. Sort of. Not really. So a few episodes ago, I just sort of slipped Pertinax into the narrative and have referred to him off and on ever since. But other than the fact that he was an able military officer and that he did his damnedest not to get involved in plots against Commodus, I haven't really told you that much about him. By far the most interesting thing to note is that, unique among emperors, at least up until this point, he was the son of a mere freedman. Born in 126, he had planned on becoming a grammar instructor, but in his late teens, he decided to have some strings pulled for him so he could be commissioned as an officer in the legions instead. Once in uniform, he immediately proved that he was a hard-working soldier and a natural leader of men, whatever his lowly background said about him. He came to the attention of Claudius Pompeianus, who was himself of lowly origin, though not as lowly as being the son of a freedman, and he became attached to the older man's staff. As Pompeianus' star rose during the reign of Marcus Aurelius, Pertinax rose along with it. Eventually, his undeniable talent won out, and Marcus decided to enroll the young man as a senator so he could grant Pertinax a full command. In 175, he was granted a suffect consulship as a reward for his excellent service, a consulship he would coincidentally share with Didius Julianus, who we will get to in a second. His rise was not without setbacks, though, and for his entire career he would have to deal with aristocratic bigotry against this son of a slave who had had the temerity to order around his social betters. During the reign of Marcus, he was briefly blacklisted following the machinations of some officials close to Faustina, who hated Pertinax for, among other things, his close relationship with Pompeianus, who she detested. During the early years of Commodus's reign, Pertinax essentially retired from public life, rather than attempt to get into a political flame war with Perennis. But once Perennis was out of the picture, Pertinax found himself back in favor and back in demand. In all, during his long career, he served with distinction in the Parthian War and the Marcomannic Wars, and at one time or another governed the provinces of Upper Moesia, Lower Moesia, Dacia, Syria, Britain, and Africa. Far from being honorary postings, these were among the most critical territories the empire had to offer. Throughout his career, there was only one real lingering flaw in his character, at least according to the troops who served under him. Unlike many other commanders, particularly those who served at Commodus's pleasure, Pertinax was not indulgent of his troops. He demanded strict discipline in the camps and had no time for whiners or complainers. They were soldiers, and they ought to act like it. There was nothing more to say on the subject. Unfortunately, this reputation would come back to haunt him once he was emperor. Strict discipline was not, for example, what the Praetorian Guard had in mind when they went and did the old man a pretty huge favor by making him emperor of the whole empire. While the Senate needed no prodding to be ecstatic about the elevation of Pertinax, the Praetorians had to be bought off. In securing their support, Pertinax had been forced to promise a huge donative to every man in the guard. Now, more than ever, the men of the imperial bodyguard didn't care who was in power, as long as they got paid. In a few short months, the crass financial underpinnings of their morality would be displayed in a way never before imaginable. But for now, they accepted the promise of money from Pertinax, and so they supported Pertinax. Out in the provinces, word spread of Commodus's demise, and though there was no political unrest following the death of the erratic and dangerous emperor, the fact of his murder, and the fact that a man who had no connection whatsoever to the now-dead Antonine dynasty had to have sparked the imaginations of more than a few powerful governors. Shortly, we will deal with 3 such powerful governors, who between them commanded a majority of the empire's legions. They all knew and appreciated the service and stature of Pertinax, and so there was no immediate uprising. But the new emperor was awfully long in the tooth, and when he went to meet his maker, who exactly would succeed him was the question on all their minds. The answer came much sooner than anyone thought. You see, when Pertinax promised a huge bonus to the Praetorians in exchange for their support, he had done so at the behest of Letus, who told him it was the only way. Once the crisis of succession was in the rearview mirror a bit, though, Pertinax reevaluated the wisdom of paying the Praetorians such an ungodly sum of money. He came through with half the amount, but declined to pay the rest, arguing that what he had already given them was more than most soldiers make in a lifetime. Besides, the imperial treasury is empty, so there's really nothing left to pay you with. But the Praetorians couldn't have cared less about where the money came from or what the average soldier made in a lifetime. They just wanted what was theirs. Pertinax considered the matter closed, though, and shifted his focus to seeing what could be done to get the empire back on track after so many years of mismanagement. The Praetorians, however, did not consider the matter closed. They were the only reason this stuffy old man was on the throne in the first place, and now he was stiffing them when the bill came due? Who did he think he was? They made him, and they could break him. In March, Pertinax visited the port of Ostia to inspect incoming grain shipments, and while there, he was given evidence proving that one of the year's consuls, a senator named Quintus Falco, had gone in with a few key members of the Guard on a plot to kill Pertinax. The Guard promised to make Falco emperor if he promised to pay up promptly and in full. Unwilling to be held hostage by a bunch of greedy bodyguards who did not know their true place in the world, Pertinax continued to refuse them the second half of the donative, but now did so knowing full well that he was putting himself in a very dangerous position. But whether out of principle, obstinacy, or something else, he refused to back down on the issue. He went so far as to avoid passing out imperial titles to his wife and children, perhaps suspecting that if and when a final showdown came, that they would be safer on the sidelines than carrying around dangerous titles like Augusta and Caesar. There was a hope prevailing in Rome early in 193 that maybe the reign of Commodus had just been a hiccup, and that with Pertinax now in power, that things could go back to normal. Commodus aside, no one living had any memory of a bad emperor. Even the oldest of the old men had been born during the reign of Trajan. Pertinax himself, a venerable elder statesman, had been born during the reign of Hadrian. The point is that for most Romans, the default setting was good emperors reigning for a long time over a relatively quiet and stable empire. So the reasoning went that since Pertinax was obviously not a crazy person, that maybe the detour through Commodus would prove to be just that, a detour. Pertinax would reign for a bit, then hand power to some worthy successor, and then he would pass power to some other worthy successor, and just like that, the memory of Commodus, already damned, would be truly forgotten. But it was not to be. Commodus was not a detour. He was the new way forward. The Romans would never again return to the road they had traveled for the last century, the one paved in wisdom, luck, and competence. No, they were on a different road now. And in late March 193, the people of Rome discovered how far they had already strayed from that good solid road they had enjoyed for so many years. The Praetorians had been indulged for too long to simply take Pertinax's stiffing lying down. Well, it wasn't just the case of the missing donative. It was also the fact that Pertinax was trying to impose a level of discipline on the urban troops that they were totally unaccustomed to. What were they, provincial infantry? They had never been hip to Pertinax to begin with, but Letus had been persuasive on the night of Commodus's death, which they had always suspected had been murder, not an embolism, and so they had gone along with their prefect. But if the past few months had proved anything, it was that this relationship just wasn't going to work. It was time for the Praetorians to break up with Pertinax. On March 28, a collection of about 300 soldiers and officers of the guard stormed the palace to confront the emperor. None of the soldiers or officials surrounding Pertinax had any desire to get in the middle of what was about to go down, so this armed company of Praetorians was allowed to pass unchallenged. Well, not totally unchallenged. Pertinax heard the commotion and dispatched Letus to go talk his men down. But when Letus, not exactly the most scrupulous guy in the world, confronted the incoming troops, he decided that joining them would be safer than trying to stop them. So he promptly about-faced and led his men straight to the emperor. Pertinax faced down the 300 Praetorians, well, 301 I guess at this point, and attempted to explain his position and reasonably diffuse the situation. Whether or not his words were starting to dissuade a majority of the men became irrelevant when one of the soldiers, who was obviously not being dissuaded, stepped forward and slashed Pertinax with his sword, killing the emperor instantly. Pertinax was 66 years old and had ruled the empire for 86 days. This rash act of violence left Letus and the Praetorians in a dilly of a pickle. As I'm sure Letus calmly explained without raising his voice or cussing anyone out, you don't just kill an emperor. At least, you don't kill an emperor without having a replacement ready to step in. Because as it stands right now, there is no emperor, and no generally agreed upon mechanism for selecting a new one. The Senate will argue that they have the right to elect the empire's new leader. The armies out in the provinces will almost certainly ignore the Senate and acclaim one of their own generals. Hell, every man in the empire will have his own pet candidate and be more than willing to fight to the death to win this highly valuable and suddenly available prize. This, he explained, is why you don't just kill an emperor. Keeping his wits about him, though, Letus thought fast and determined that at the end of the day, the Praetorians still really held all the cards here. We'll just pick whoever we want, bully the Senate into ratifying the choice, and have everything wrapped up before the provincial governors even hear that Pertinax is dead. But who did the Praetorians want? At that moment, what they wanted was someone who would pay up when he was supposed to pay up. That was their whole beef with Pertinax, and the reason why they were standing over his bloody body trying to figure out who to replace him with. So, Letus hit upon a great idea. A really, really great idea that was just really, really great. They would auction off the job to the highest bidder. Letus ordered his agents out into the city to spread the news that Pertinax was dead and that the Praetorians were entertaining bids to be his replacement. What followed obviously became one of the most notorious incidents in Roman imperial history. No self-respecting senator was going to get into a bidding war to win the honor of becoming the Praetorians' puppet, which meant that only senators of a more morally ambiguous nature were going to enter into the auction. But then again, if only morally ambiguous men entered in the bidding, then maybe it was the duty of a self-respecting senator to step in and outbid the bad seeds. It was quite a conundrum. In the end, events moved so quickly that the bidding came down to two men who were neither inflexibly virtuous nor necessarily terrible men. They just acted on their instincts, their vanity, and the belief that someone was going to get the job, so it might as well be them. The first was Pertinax's father-in-law, a man named Titus Flavius Sulpicianus. Sulpicianus had been appointed city prefect upon his son-in-law's ascension, and when the company of Praetorians had invaded the palace, Pertinax had dispatched Sulpicianus down to the Praetorian camp to hopefully quell any further unrest. So he found himself physically present when the murderous company returned to base with his son-in-law's head on a spike, and was the first to hear their plan to auction off the imperial throne. Sulpicianus, probably first out of a desire to simply restore order as quickly as possible, put in a bid, but the Praetorians decided it was too low, and shouted from the ramparts that anyone who could do better ought to come down straight away and do better. The second man involved in this infamous auction, and the one who would eventually win the dubious prize, was Marcus Didius Julianus. He was enjoying a lavish dinner with his family when the news came that the imperial throne was up for grabs. According to most sources, Julianus was pushed into making a bid by his wife and daughter, who were themselves hungrier for power than Julianus himself was. But sometimes I can't help but take these portrayals of shrewish Roman women with a grain of salt. If Julianus needed to be pushed into it, I doubt he needed to be pushed very hard. But whether he jumped at the chance or had to be pushed or pulled or nudged or whatever, Julianus rushed from his banquet table down to the Praetorian camp. He was barred from actually passing through the gates by suspicious guards, but, undeterred, he shouted his offer over the walls. The men on the ramparts dutifully relayed Julianus's bid to their comrades in the center of camp, and Sulpicianus upped his bid accordingly. The men raced back to the wall, where they told Julianus what the new price was, and Julianus upped his own bid accordingly. Now this is what the Praetorians had in mind. Finally, Sulpicianus offered 20,000 sesterces a head for the privilege of becoming emperor, an absurd sum that equaled something like 8 times the annual salary of the average Praetorian. But Julianus, caught up in the moment and determined not to lose, promised 25,000 sesterces a head. At this last offer, the Praetorians were satisfied, and, maybe worried that continuing the auction would lead both men to walk away from the table, declared Julianus the winner, ushered him into camp, and acclaimed him emperor. Proving that he was not totally morally bankrupt, which he really wasn't, Julianus stipulated that his promised donative was contingent upon no harm coming to Sulpicianus. The Praetorians agreed and let the losing bidder go, though he had to see himself out, as the soldiers were all temporarily blinded by the massive dollar signs in their eyes. They were all about to be rich men. They should really do this more often. The Praetorians then marched out into the streets to rouse the Senate and demand that they assemble at once to make their choice official. They came down to the forum, and after listening to Julianus make a speech about how all of this wasn't nearly as dishonorable as it appeared, and reminding them that they all knew him and knew him well, that he was a good man, and he would lead the empire back to glory. With armed soldiers literally standing over their shoulders, the Senate nodded in agreement, and Didius Julianus became emperor. Now what he had said was basically true. Marcus Didius Julianus had been around a long time, was well known, and not for infamous reasons. He had been born in the 130s, the exact date is under dispute, to an Italian father and a Roman African mother, both of whom came from distinguished senatorial families. By a stroke of luck, he wound up being raised in the home of Domitia Lucilla, the mother of Marcus Aurelius. He didn't have much contact with Marcus, who was at least 15 years his senior, but when Marcus became emperor, it did not hurt Julianus's career one bit that he was a favorite of the emperor's mother. He climbed up the cursus honorum in brisk fashion, and when the Marcomannic Wars broke out, he found himself the governor of Upper Germany, which, while not exactly the front lines, was still a key theater of the war. Julianus and his fellows along the Rhine were tasked with fending off attacks on the limes Germanicus and preventing the Germans from even thinking about expanding the conflict. Julianus was completely successful in his mission, and deftly deflected numerous attempts at invasion from local tribes allied with the Marcomanni. As a reward for his good work, as I mentioned before, He was given a consulship in 175 along with Pertinax. During the reign of Commodus, he mostly kept his head down, and despite being accused of involvement in one of the various plots against the emperor's life, he was acquitted and wound up serving as provincial governor in Bithynia, and then later succeeded Pertinax as proconsul of Africa. He was back in Rome and enjoying the life of a wealthy aristocrat during the last year of Commodus's reign, however much a wealthy aristocrat could enjoy his life with Commodus's mad whims hanging over his head all the time, and was finally, as I said, enjoying a nice dinner when Pertinax was murdered. Before the sun rose the next morning, he was in the imperial palace, and likely wondering if the night's events had been a strange dream. But it was no dream. Julianus was emperor. It was time for the Praetorians to initiate the final phase of their brilliant plan: kick back and live like kings. But this final phase was premised on the assumption that there would be no repercussions for the double crime of murdering Pertinax and selling off the throne. This was, as you can imagine, as faulty an assumption as there has ever been in the long history of faulty assumptions. In the full light of day, the magnitude of how faulty that assumption was became all too clear. When Julianus traveled through the streets, he was hissed at and booed at by the people, who called him names and pelted him with rocks. The Senate, with swords in their faces, had agreed to honor his claim to the throne, but to a man they now reviled Julianus and considered his residence in the imperial palace a mockery. If Pertinax's mistake had been ignoring the Praetorians, Julianus's crime was in paying them exclusive attention, because outside the couple of thousand members of the guard, no one else supported him, and there was a lot more men in the provincial armies than there were in the urban cohorts, if you catch my drift. Next week, the chickens will come home to roost. None of the governors out in the provinces had any intention of offering fealty to this imperial impostor. And the three most powerful, Septimius Severus in Pannonia, Claudius Albinus in Britain, and Pescennius Niger in Syria, will each further intend not only to brush aside Julianus and his ridiculous claims to the throne, but to step in and take power for themselves. Hello, and welcome to the History of Rome. Episode 99, What Evil Have I Done? So the Praetorians had pulled off the perfect crime. They had murdered an emperor and replaced him with a man whose only claim to the throne was that he had promised to pay them all a boatload of cash. Yep, they were set for life, and nothing could touch them. They were, after all, the Praetorian Guard. The Praetorian Guard. While Commodus reigned, the various cabals of corrupt imperial officials who came and went over the years had wielded near absolute power over the people, and the Praetorians had been the iron hand keeping them all in line. So perhaps the last 12 years had made the Guard a bit myopic. What they were forgetting was that Commodus had paid enough attention to the provincial legions that they never really considered rebellion. Plus, he was the son of Marcus Aurelius, who was the son of Antoninus, who was the son of Hadrian, who was the son of Trajan. The legitimacy of his rule was never really in question. Maybe his antics left something to be desired, but it's not like anyone could really mount a legal brief proving that they had more of a claim to the throne than Commodus, son of Marcus, son of Antoninus, etc., etc. But now, well, in their hubris, the Praetorians had missed the fact that killing Pertinax and putting Julianus in power meant that all bets were now off. It did not take long for the Praetorians to realize their mistake. Word spread quickly about what had happened to Pertinax and what had happened after he was dead. The leading governors across the empire, each on their own initiative, refused to recognize Julianus as the lawful emperor, and instead simply got down to the business of deciding who they wanted to replace Julianus with. Coincidentally, the answer each one of them came up with was the same: me. In April 193, Claudius Albinus, Septimius Severus, and Pescennius Niger each stood at the head of their armies, and, vowing to revenge the murder of Pertinax and restore dignity to the empire, they were each hailed emperor by their assembled troops. Well, technically Albinus refused the title emperor, but the effect was the same. This meant that unless they could come to some sort of agreement with one another, this trifecta of pretenders meant only one thing: civil war. And I don't want to give anything away, but guess what? They don't really come to an agreement with one another. As quickly as word reached the legionary camps that Julianus was emperor, word came back to Julianus that, yeah right, wanna bet? But having mortgaged a great deal of his honor in buying the imperial throne, Julianus was not prepared to just give it up at the first sign of trouble. He was an experienced commander and administrator. Now was the time to muster all that experience and fight to keep what he had paid for. He rightly concluded that Niger and Albinus were too far away to pose an immediate threat. But Septimius Severus in Pannonia? That right there was most definitely an immediate threat. The discipline of the Danube legions and the quality of the Roman roads meant that if he wanted to, Severus could march his army to the gates of Rome in a matter of weeks. Severus had to be neutralized immediately. So for the crime of treason against the new emperor, Julianus, again with armed soldiers literally standing over the Senate's shoulders, induced the body to declare Severus a public enemy and pass a sentence of death against the rogue general. Severus, meanwhile, wasted no time breaking camp. He knew, just as Julianus knew, that he was the closest of the provincial generals to Rome. If he moved fast, he would be able to beat Albinus and Niger to the punch, and, invoking the old possession is 9/10 of the law thing, dare them to challenge him, not Julianus, for control of the capital. Plus, once Julianus the dishonorable usurper was ousted, and our beloved Pertinax avenged, a lot of the rhetorical wind would go out of their arguments. Gibbon estimated that, with the prize of supreme power in sight, that Severus pushed his troops to the limit and marched them at a clip of about 20 miles a day toward Rome. As he was on the move, Severus had a Machiavellian brainstorm. His next closest rival, geographically speaking, was Albinus up in Britain. Albinus was an excellent commander, and the British legions, while lacking some of the prestige of Severus's Danube troops, was still a formidable army. There was little doubt, though, that in the end, Pescennius Niger, who would be able to muster the full resources of the rich Eastern Empire, would prove to be Severus's more formidable opponent. So Severus sent a note up to Albinus, who was also, by the way, the youngest of the three, promising that if Albinus backed Severus as emperor, Severus would name Albinus Caesar, effectively making him the heir apparent. Albinus, in part because it satisfied his personal ambition, but also in part because aligning with Severus would head off civil war, agreed to the terms, and just like that, Septimius Severus had locked up the whole Western Empire. Whether he was aware of these further developments is unknown, but it didn't really matter. Julianus was already stricken by the justifiable fear that he had nothing at his disposal that could match up against the 3 Pannonian legions. Tossing in the British troops was really just piling on. So, still scrambling for any means of survival, he sent a group of senators north to convince the Pannonian troops with a bundle of carrots and sticks that they ought to abandon their leader's cause. However, doubting that the delegation would have much of an effect, Julianus also sent some hand-picked men on a secret mission to just assassinate Severus and be done with him. By hook or crook, Severus had to be stopped before he reached Rome, or else Julianus was doomed. While he waited to hear how his various missions turned out, he set what men he had, that is, the Praetorians and the urban cohorts, to work fortifying the city and drilling for battle to keep their minds from dwelling on the fact that they were all probably dead men. Severus passed into Italy without meeting any resistance and occupied Ravenna, home of the imperial fleet, simply by showing up and announcing that he was now occupying Ravenna. With eventual victory all but assured, Severus was finally met by the various delegations sent by Julianus to talk him out of it, or kill him, or whatever. The assassination squad was detected long before it got close to Severus, and failed to penetrate the general's outer circle, let alone his inner one. The senators, though, were allowed to meet the general and make their case. Far from convincing Severus to abandon his cause or the troops to abandon Severus, the group heard what Severus had to say, namely that Julianus did not stand a chance and that he was about to become emperor. They immediately switched sides. The desperate Julianus then ordered a token force north to try to halt the incoming Pannonian legions, but they were brushed aside with hardly a fight. The only notable thing about the skirmish is that it was the first time Romans had fought Romans in 124 years. It would not, by any means, be the last. As he continued south, towns and cities threw their doors open to Severus and hailed him emperor. So not only had Julianus failed to stop Severus, but his rival was picking up steam and shrouding himself in something of an aura of inevitability. Panicked, Julianus sent a message north to his rival, declaring that he would be open to discussing some sort of power-sharing agreement. But Severus knew what the score was, and he flatly rejected the offer. He stopped about 70 miles north of Rome in late May 193 and prepared for his final march on the city. He didn't want to take it by force, though. After all, he was about to have to lead these people, and if he wanted to stay in office longer than Julianus, he couldn't kick things off by making a bloody mess of the capital. So he opened negotiations to isolate Julianus and remove him from power peacefully. He started by informing the Praetorians that they would not be punished if they agreed to hand over the men who had killed Pertinax. After about 17 seconds of debate, they agreed to the terms and delivered Letus and the others to Severus's men. Not a man to beat around the bush, Severus had them all killed immediately. This show of murderous resolve convinced all the men surrounding Julianus that the time to abandon the doomed foe emperor was right about now. The Praetorians informed the Senate that they no longer supported Julianus, and on June 1st, the Senate responded by declaring Severus the lawful emperor and Julianus an enemy of the state. The exact circumstances of Julianus's fate are variously told, but the most common version is that the defrocked Julianus, now left miserably alone in the palace, was apprehended by a company of soldiers, marched into a private chamber, and beheaded. His last words were recorded as the pitiful, but not entirely unjustified plea, "What evil have I done? Whom have I killed?" He was either 56 or 58 years old, and had ruled Rome for a grand total of 66 days. With Julianus deposed and both the Senate and Praetorians declaring him their sovereign, Septimius Severus became emperor of the Roman Empire. His claim to power was not totally secure, and there was still much to be done, but I don't think I'm giving anything away when I say that he will successfully outmaneuver his rivals, and in the process, found a new imperial dynasty that will rule Rome more or less uninterrupted for the next 42 years. It was, when you get right down to it, quite a feat for an obscure half-Punic, half-Roman equite from Libya. Lucius Septimius Severus had been born in 145 in the province of Africa, right at the beginning of the golden age of Antoninus. His father was a native, though thoroughly Romanized, African of equestrian rank, but his mother was Italian and related to a prominent Roman family. Though his own immediate family was not particularly influential, his father apparently never held political office, he had two cousins back in Italy, Uncle Publius and Uncle Gaius, who would both serve as consuls during the reign of Antoninus. Gaius Septimius Severus in particular would be the bridge young Lucius used to cross over from obscurity to prominence. The details of his youth are not particularly well known, but he was educated as much as a minor provincial family could afford, and by the time he was 17, his expressed interest in making more of himself than his father had led Uncle Gaius to recommend him to the new emperor, Marcus Aurelius. But despite the endorsement, giving some young provincial a special leg up wasn't on Marcus's to-do list at the time, and so Severus languished in a sort of limbo, waiting patiently to reach the minimum age to serve as quaestor, when it was hoped that Marcus would appoint him to office, and simultaneously enroll him in the Senate. And this obviously did not mark him for greatness, as most men destined for the purple had all these age requirements waived, and had already served as consul by now. But then again, Severus wasn't aiming to be emperor. He was simply shooting for prominence. Things actually got a little bit worse for young Severus in the mid to late 160s, as he waited patiently for the expected assignment. The Antonine Plague infected Rome, and Severus prudently, if a bit dejectedly, left the diseased capital and returned to Africa where things were safer. He had left home with high hopes, and now he was right back where he had started, with nothing to show for it but a few wasted years. But the plague, which seemed like it might be the final nail in the coffin of whatever grand ambitions Severus secretly harbored for himself, actually turned out to be the defibrillator that brought those ambitions back to life. In addition to being a human tragedy of enormous proportions, the plague had the practical effect of creating many a vacancy in the imperial government. Just as the Second Punic War, and specifically the disaster at Cannae, had cleared out most of the rising stars of the old patrician families and opened the door for men of merit wherever they might be found, so too did the Antonine Plague leave room for men who likely never would have been granted a second look had the old aristocracy not been dropping like flies. I think Pompeianus benefited from these conditions. Pertinax certainly rose higher than he otherwise would have, and young Severus, nobody provincial, would soon find his application for membership in the Senate readily granted and important business happily heaped upon his shoulders. But even here, Severus's career progressed in fits and starts. He was assigned a proquaestorship in the Spanish senatorial province of Baetica, but soon after taking up the posting his father died, forcing Severus to return home to assume the mantle of paterfamilias. While he was gone, which means we can infer this was around 172 or so, the Moors invaded Spain and threw the region into crisis. The Senate handed control of Baetica to the emperor, and in trade, the emperor granted the Senate authority over the island of Sardinia. So when he was ready to return to duty, Severus was redirected to the moderately hostile backwater of Sardinia rather than the lush and wealthy coast of Spain. But Uncle Gaius still saw promise in the young man, though it should be admitted he was not quite so young anymore. He was serious and dedicated, and so when Gaius Severus was assigned the proconsulship of Africa, he picked his younger cousin to serve on his staff. In 175, the now 30-year-old Severus married a local African girl, and though they were married 11 years, she would die in 186, no children resulted from the union. Around that same time, he was the recipient of imperial favor, and appointed to serve as one of the now entirely honorary tribune of the plebs back in Rome. For the decade that followed, he would find himself fully in the emperor's good graces, and assigned to key political and military posts across the empire, mostly in Spain and Gaul. When Commodus succeeded his father, Severus was close enough to the imperial family that Commodus trusted him, without being so close that Commodus felt threatened by him. Shortly after Lucilla's failed plot to kill her brother, though, Severus did temporarily fall from favor when he botched, perhaps intentionally, the job of tracking down one of the conspirators who had fled east. But this was a minor blip on Severus's now firmly established record, and before too long, he was called back into service. In 186, Severus's first wife died, and he set himself to finding a new partner. This time, one he hoped would help catapult his career to the next level. Belief in astrology and divination was as strong in the empire as it had ever been, and Severus in particular bought into the whole system completely. He was informed by some mystics that there was a woman in the east who was destined to marry a king. So Severus immediately went forth to track her down and marry her. The woman in question was a Syrian named Julia Domna, who was descended from a line of kings established by Pompey during his initial political reorganization of the East in the 60s BC. Though her family's royalty had long been stripped away, her father was a high priest in the small but important mystery religion that dedicated itself to the worship of Elagabal, god of the sun. Severus talked his way into an engagement with the woman who was destined to marry a king, and in the summer of 187, the two were wed. The marriage would prove to be a happy and fruitful one. Julia would go down as one of the more beloved empresses of all time, and apart from earning praise for her intelligence, wit, and political savvy, she was also a tireless promoter of the arts, philosophy, and poetry. Though she did her best to stem the tide, her work was largely a losing battle against a Greco-Roman culture that had stagnated and felt content to worship past masters rather than cultivate their generation's own voices. In 188, Severus's first son, Lucius Septimius Bassianus, was born, and in 189, a second son, Publius Septimius Geta, followed. Though the elder son would be known during his own life as Lucius, we know him today by the nickname that was rarely uttered in his presence, but which I'll use to refer to him from here on out, Caracalla. The feud with his younger brother Geta, the means by which he resolved said feud, and the tyrannical regime he subsequently oversaw following his father's death would become the stuff of legend, and Caracalla provided most, but not all of the reasons we usually call the Severan dynasty, the troubled Severan dynasty. Before we move on from Severus's growing nuclear family, though, I should mention that his new sister-in-law, Julia Maesa, will soon become a major player in her own right. It was her young grandsons, whom we know as Elagabalus and Alexander Severus, who will round out the ill-fated Severan dynasty. Both 14 at the time of their respective ascensions, Julia Maesa will wield considerable influence behind the scenes, and in her heyday was the most powerful Roman woman the empire had ever seen since the time of Agrippina. His family growing happily and rapidly, though what it grew into was an entirely different story, Severus finally received that bright feather political men still strove to put in their caps, despite its ultimate irrelevance, by being named consul in 190. As you'll recall, though, his consulship was even more irrelevant than most, his naming coming as it did in the middle of Cleander's scandalous list of 25 for the year. The following year, Severus was assigned to the key governorship of Pannonia, which brings us back to where we just began. The assassination of Commodus, the murder of Pertinax, the elevation of Julianus. Severus was willing to accept Pertinax, and so kept his men in check during what had to be at least a slightly chaotic period following Commodus's demise. But Julianus? Julianus was not to be accepted, nor tolerated, nor even resigned to. Julianus was to be removed. Severus entered Rome in June 193 as the acknowledged master of the Roman Empire, king in all but name, just as the oracles had predicted. His first act was to order the disgraced Praetorian Guard to assemble unarmed on a plain outside the city walls, where they were surrounded by his own armed troops. The Praetorians were no doubt thinking that Severus's promise of no recriminations was about to be revealed as just a clever expedient, and that they were all about to pay the ultimate price for their greed and hubris, but Severus instead simply ordered them to disband. That is, the Praetorian Guard was abolished. The now former members of the Guard escaped with their lives, but found their livelihoods stripped away in an instant. In place of the old Praetorians, which had been an assembly of mostly Italian, mostly well-to-do soldiers, who treated the posting as purely ceremonial and little more than an opportunity to live high on the hog at the empire's expense, Severus instituted a new order of Praetorians. This one would be 4 times as large and be made up of provincial soldiers. Rather than a social club for pampered Italians, the Guard was reconstructed to be the premier military unit in the empire, and served as the ultimate reward for excellent service in the legions. Promotion of the Praetorians was, in other words, now open to any soldier who earned the right. The effects of this reconstruction were threefold. First, it further increased the distance between the citizens of Rome and their emperor. Rather than the barrier separating the two being made up of armed Italians, who at least looked like the citizens of Rome and talked like them, and were in many cases related to them, the barrier was now made up of a motley group of uncouth provincial soldiers who shared nothing in common with the citizenry of the capital. From this point on, basically, no one had a cousin in the guard anymore who could, bend the rules a bit now and then. The second ramification of the Praetorian reorganization was that it wound up draining away talent from the provinces. When the best soldiers are promoted up to a posting in Rome, well, they're not around to help dig trenches anymore, or lead men in battle, or generally ensure that the borders remain secure. Though only one of many factors that led to the disastrous barbarian invasions of the next century, it certainly didn't help that all the best men were stationed in Rome rather than on the Danube when the Goths came calling. Finally, when the old guard was disbanded, they took with them the last few Italians still serving in uniform. The Roman legions were now no longer in any sense Roman legions. From here on out, wherever you looked, you saw foreign faces under those helmets. The Romans themselves were now content to let others do the fighting for them. This abandonment of their martial heritage is high on the list of potential reasons why the Western Empire ultimately fell. But as of yet, these reorganizations were still just a glimmer in Severus's eye. He had been recognized by the Senate and the Praetorians, but so what? So had the late Didius Julianus. Pescennius Niger was still in Syria, still in control of the resources of the Eastern Empire, and still showing every indication that he was planning to become emperor himself. Claudius Albinus was temporarily sated, but Severus knew that Albinus would not be so docile when the new emperor revealed his plan to double-cross his supposed heir, and instead name his sons Caracalla and Geta co-Caesars. Next week, Severus will face down his two rivals in a three-way battle for power that will finally unlock the Pandora's box of civil war that the Romans had successfully kept shut for 125 years. Hello, and welcome to the History of Rome, Episode 100, Black and White and Severus All Over. On June 1st, 193 AD, Septimius Severus was officially recognized as emperor by the Senate and people of Rome. In theory, he now controlled the whole empire, but in practice he was only master of its western half. Unlike the Danube legions and the British legions, who both at this point backed Severus, the troops in Syria and Egypt recognized Pescennius Niger's claim to the throne and would have scoffed at any attempt by Severus to order them around. There were high hopes all around, though, that political tensions between East and West could be resolved without bloodshed, but it was not to be. The basic fact was that Severus was convinced that he had every right to the throne, and Niger was also convinced that he had every right to the throne. Keeping the aftermath of Julianus's rise and fall bloodless meant that one of the two generals was going to have to back down and take a subordinate role to the other. Claudius Albinus had already allowed himself to be so subordinated, but neither Niger nor Severus had any intention of following his example. And so, unfortunately, civil war. But Severus was savvy about optics, as evidenced by the care he took in keeping his initial coup a bloodless one. Well, relatively bloodless. Julianus and the men who had murdered Pertinax were dead, but no one liked them anyway, so they don't really count. In all his public posturing, Severus intimated that Niger was his friend and colleague, and that they couldn't possibly have any real quarrel with one another, since they were such good friends and such good colleagues. Their two armies had both acted nobly in rejecting Julianus and independently hailing their leader's emperor, but now that Pertinax was avenged, it was time for them to act nobly again and reject discord in favor of concord. Despite his public front of hopeful hope and friendly friendship, though, Severus and his lieutenants were diligently preparing for war. They well knew that, barring a miracle, the only place Severus and Niger would be able to conclusively settle the issue of who was emperor would be on the battlefield. Thus, 30 days after he arrived in Rome, Severus ordered his forces to break camp and head east. He told the Senate and the people that he was merely on his way to tour and inspect the eastern provinces, and pointedly made no mention of Niger or his rival claim to power. But those in the know knew that Severus was on his way to demand the approaching Syrian legions recognize him as their emperor or face destruction. We know basically how things are going to turn out in the contest between Severus and Niger, and we'll get to the details in a second. But before we get into the particulars, I should point out that things didn't have to turn out this way. Indeed, to many at the time, the ascension and subsequent victories of Severus came as quite a shock. You see, a pretty good chunk of the political class simply assumed that the job was naturally going to pass over to Pescennius Niger. From the moment Julianus bought the throne, they expected Niger, not Severus, to be the man who would ride triumphantly into the city, cow the Praetorians, and restore order. All the Syrian governor had to do was get on his horse and ride. But then a funny thing happened. The presumed successor to Julianus never showed up for his coronation ceremony. There is not a ton in the historical record about Pescennius Niger, but we do know that he was born in the late 130s AD, round about the time that power was being transferred from Hadrian to Antoninus, making him the eldest of our three claimants to the throne. Like Severus, he had come from an upper middle-class family of equites, and, also like Severus, saw his career advance rapidly during that age of upward mobility, made possible by the Parthian War, the Marcomannic Wars, and the Antonine Plague. Early in Commodus's reign, he had been made a senator and then appointed to a military command in Dacia, where he served alongside Claudius Albinus and helped settle a brief Sarmatian uprising. After that, he was enough in Commodus's confidence that when the Deserters' War broke out in 186, it was Niger who was ordered into Gaul to put the rebel army down. Probably as a reward for his success in this endeavor, Commodus appointed Niger to the all-important governorship of Syria. Arriving in Antioch, he endeared himself to the population by taking a liberal attitude towards local custom, and for encouraging the kind of games Marcus had outlawed, and endeared himself to the legions by maintaining discipline without being overly harsh or strict about anything. He remained happily situated in Syria until the chaos of 193 led him to pack up his things and lead his armies toward Rome. Very slowly pack up his things, and very slowly lead his armies toward Rome. Not to Rome, mind you, just toward Rome. He never would get there. The problem with Niger, and the thing that most especially led to his fall, was the fact that he did not feel the fierce urgency of now. When Septimius Severus decided to make his bid for the throne, he spent every waking moment preparing to march on Rome, and when preparations were complete, he spent every waking moment actually marching on Rome, and when he arrived, he spent every waking moment figuring out exactly how he was going to keep the power he had grabbed. Pescennius Niger, on the other hand, was far more lackadaisical about everything. Given a more vigorous response, he might have, like Vespasian before him, leveraged his position as de facto leader of the Eastern Empire into de jure leader of the whole empire. But he dillied and he dallied, and when he finally got around to making his move, it was too late. 2 months had passed since the death of Julianus, and Niger was just now barely leaving Antioch. He wouldn't even make it to the Hellespont before being met by Severus's Danube legions, who, in the same amount of time, had marched from Pannonia to Rome, ousted Julianus, sat around for a bit catching their breath as Severus planned their next move, and then crossed the Adriatic, marched across Macedonia and Thrace, all the way to the Hellespont. It is quite obvious, then, which general was feeling said fierce urgency of now, and which was feeling the fierce urgency of whenever. Up until the very end, Severus and Niger maintained an officially friendly correspondence that pretended war was not imminent. But finally, the charade was called off when the two armies met in battle. seeing as how it's kind of hard to pretend you have nothing but the most peaceful of intentions when you're simultaneously ordering your cavalry in to ride and hack your rival to pieces. The advance guards of both armies found each other in the province of Bithynia and fought two separate engagements in the late summer of 193, which, though too large to be considered skirmishes, were also too small to be decisive. In both fights, though, Niger's eastern troops looked badly overmatched against the veteran Pannonian legions and were beaten handily. The ascension of Niger, which at first had seemed so right, so logical, and so inevitable, was now turning out to be so very clearly a pipe dream. Winter overtook the contest, though, and when the new year dawned, Severus cemented his alliance with Albinus by sharing a consulship with the British general. He further let it be known that while he was prosecuting the war in the east, that he fully trusted Albinus to maintain the peace and tranquility of the west. His other rival now fully complacent, Severus wasted no time trying to land the final blow against Niger when spring arrived. In the meantime, Niger had withdrawn his forces almost all the way back to Syria and had set up a fortified position near the village of Issus at a location known as the Cilician Gates, a narrow east-west passage wedged in between the southern coastline of Turkey and the sharply rising Taurus Mountains to the north. When you Google the Battle of Issus, though, your first hits will not point you to the decisive battle between Severus and Niger, but rather to the decisive battle between Alexander the Great and the Persians, fought over 500 years earlier on exactly the same spot. But Niger, as they say, was no Alexander. Though the two forces were roughly equal in size, 3 legions apiece plus some auxiliaries, the Danube troops, tempered in the fires of the Marcomannic Wars, were simply superior to the Syrian troops, who had been tempered in the fires of, well, not much really. The Parthian War was already 30 years past, and as a result, none of the soldiers in the east had any real experience with any real fighting. Niger's men made a go of it, but they were already beginning to fall back when Severus's cavalry, sent around on a secret mission prior to the battle, suddenly appeared at their rear. Chaos and slaughter ensued, and Niger was forced to flee the battlefield. His army now completely destroyed, the Syrian governor was apparently making for Parthia, where he hoped to find asylum and perhaps the resources to make another bid for the throne one day. But he was caught before he reached the Euphrates, and like Julianus before him, was unceremoniously beheaded. The head was sent back to Severus, who forwarded it on to the smallish but well-fortified city of Byzantium, where what was left of the Niger loyalists had holed up. Though their leader's head now sat atop a spike in front of the city gates, Niger's remaining lieutenants obstinately refused to surrender. At first, they held out simply to refuse Severus the satisfaction of victory, but eventually they came to believe that Claudius Albinus would eventually heed the various calls for him to get into the ring, and that maybe, just maybe, they could live long enough to see Severus's head on a spike too. But after a 2-year holdout, famine got the better of them, and the last of Niger's soldiers finally surrendered Byzantium in 196. Severus ordered all the walls and fortifications of the city be toppled, reducing Byzantium to just another open village, which is exactly how Constantine found it more than a century later. In between the occupation and surrender of Byzantium, Severus busied himself in the east. Still hoping to maintain some thin veneer of clemency, Severus did not simply go around to the various provinces killing those leading men who had supported Niger, but he did do the next harshest thing he could think of. Anyone associated with the fallen Syrian governor, no matter how tenuously, was purged from political office and their property confiscated. The ill-gotten, but not murderously so, gains were then directed by Severus to his faithful soldiers. The soon-to-be undisputed emperor had no illusions about where his power was derived from, and no desire to beat around the bush in his plans to hold on to that power. For the entirety of the Severan dynasty, starting with Severus himself, it would be the army first, last, and always. Indeed, As he lay dying, he gave his sons one last piece of advice, summing up his whole political philosophy in one short sentence. Be harmonious with each other, enrich the soldiers, and scorn all other men. Severus's position was crystallizing, but since you can't return home to a triumph if your victory comes against your fellow Romans, literally, it was against the rules, Severus embarked on a brief campaign against the Parthians to give himself a nice foreign victory to point to. Following a series of practically non-contested victories in the Parthian borderlands beyond the Euphrates, Severus was finally confident enough in his grasp on power that he decided to drop the pretense that he was going to make Albinus his heir and announced that his young son Caracalla was now to be known as Marcus Aurelius Septimius Bassianus Antoninus, and would be next in line for the throne. This news came as something of a nasty surprise to Albinus in Britain, whose support for Severus, after all, had been premised on being named Severus's heir. The announcement also put an incident from the previous year in a new light. After defeating Niger, Severus had sent a note to Albinus proclaiming the triumph, but when the messengers arrived and requested a private audience with Albinus, they had whipped out daggers and tried to kill him. The assassination attempt had been unsettling, but it had also been difficult to believe, based on every other thing he had ever said or done, that Severus had been the one who ordered the attack. But now that Albinus was getting the old double-cross, the random assassination attempt by some rogue soldiers took on a much more sinister light, because Severus had obviously tried to kill him. In 196, now fully aware that he had been duped into complacency for the last 2.5 years, Albinus finally accepted all that his troops wanted him to accept. He allowed himself to be hailed Imperator, kept the name Caesar, and prepared himself for war with Severus. He crossed over the English Channel into Gaul with 3 legions and a host of auxiliaries that Cassius Dio estimated to be some 150,000 total men, though, like all ancient figures, this is likely an exaggeration. He was met initially by a smaller force led by one of Severus's generals, who had been tasked with halting the invasion, or, at the very least, slowing it down. Albinus dispatched Severus's welcoming party with ease, though, and the setback gave some on the Severan side pause. Maybe we should come to some sort of agreement with Albinus. It turns out that fighting him isn't exactly going to be a walk in the park, you know? But Severus himself seemed undaunted, and readied himself for what he was confident would be his final test. Beating Albinus meant that the empire would be his, free and clear. Albinus was able to occupy Lugdunum, the capital of Roman Gaul, but he was unable to do the one thing he really needed to do to win. Severus now had, British legions accepted, the whole of the empire behind him. There was no way Albinus would be able to match Severus's reserve of men and material, unless he was able to convince the Rhine legions to join his cause. Thus far a non-factor in the war, the Rhine legions had remained essentially neutral, though they had leaned heavily toward Severus against Niger. Albinus hoped he could coax them into his camp, but all his entreaties were spurned, as the Rhine troops instead dug in their support for Severus, pegging him to be the eventual winner in any contest that they themselves did not get involved in. Having failed to sway the Rhine troops, Albinus still persisted in his preparations for battle, but now his mission seemed to be working itself up to be a romantic last stand, rather than a stunning victory against the growing tyranny of Severus. Like Septimius Severus, Claudius Albinus had been born in Africa, though unlike Severus, Albinus was the son of a wealthy senatorial family, and was by far the most pedigreed of the 3 rivals for power. He earned the cognomen Albinus shortly after his birth in 147, when his father commented on the boy's unusually pale skin, though he was not an albino per se, as it is sometimes thought. From the very beginning, he was set on a military career, and as a young man, quickly established a reputation as an excellent soldier. He served in various capacities throughout the first half of the Marcomannic Wars, and was, at an early age, promoted to the governorship of Bithynia for the year 175. That meant that he was in Bithynia when the revolt of Avidius Cassius broke out. Rather than join the other eastern provinces, Albinus withheld the single legion he controlled from Cassius and instead remained loyal to Marcus. This endeared him to the emperor and his son Commodus, who, you'll recall, was there during the crisis and learned quickly who was with his family and who was opposed to them. For the entirety of Commodus's reign, Albinus continued to be held in high esteem by the emperor and was given commands in Gaul and then finally the powerful governorship of Britain. Gibbon remarks that we should not hold it against Albinus that he was so well liked by Commodus, and that sometimes even men who usually favor the corrupt and venal, occasionally, almost by accident, favor the honest and capable, which by all estimations Albinus was. In fact, Albinus actually took things a little bit further than that. In early 192, a believable rumor reached his headquarters in Britain that Commodus was dead, and in response, Albinus delivered an address to his troops, condemning the excesses and brutality of Commodus, and openly calling for a return to a republican form of government. By the time the speech was over, he had outed himself as a full-blown critic of the imperial system, and likely would have paid for the crime with his life, had not Commodus really been killed just a few months later, before the emperor could deal with his suddenly treasonous governor of Britain. Just like with Severus and Niger, the elevation of Pertinax came as welcome news to Albinus, but the elevation of Julianus did not. Perhaps in a nod to his republican sympathies, Albinus initially refused the title Imperator and Augustus, and allowed himself to be styled merely as a lieutenant of the people. But, perhaps further revealing that some of those republican sympathies were more rhetorical and theoretical than actual, he allowed himself to be seduced by Severus's offer of Caesarhood, and so stood by while Severus annihilated Niger. But after Caracalla was elevated in Albinus's place, Severus was exposed as a ruthless, two-faced tyrant who was not to be trusted nor followed. In Albinus's mind, it was now his duty, as the only man in a position to do something about it, to do something about Septimius Severus. In February 197, Albinus very nearly did something about it. The force Severus mustered to face down his last rival was roughly equal to that of Albinus's army. That is, Severus's army is also quoted to be at the aforementioned 150,000, which meant that at least for this one fight, the two generals were on equal footing. The size of the two armies also meant that this was the largest legion-on-legion fight in the whole long history of Rome. By contrast, the Battle of Pharsalus featured a mere 30,000 troops for Caesar and maybe 60,000 for Pompey, a combined total that would have been dwarfed by a single side in this latest fight for control of the empire. Even taking into account the exaggeration factor, the Battle of Lugdunum had to have been an absolutely humongous affair. In contrast to the other battles won in his name, Severus decided this fight was critical enough that he needed to be there in person to lead his armies, and with Albinus personally directing his own forces, the fight turned into a slugfest between two evenly matched armies, both being led by highly intelligent commanders. For most of the day, the two sides both gave as good as they got. When Albinus's left wing began to give way, Severus's left wing simultaneously fell into a trap that nearly cost Severus his life when he was caught in a chaotic retreat away from a booby-trapped field. But eventually, the Severans wore down Albinus's men and broke through their lines. Albinus himself fled the field and retreated back to a house in the still as of yet untaken city of Lugdunum. But, recognizing that the day was lost and that it was only a matter of time before he was captured and executed, Claudius Albinus committed suicide. It is reported that Severus showed no respect for Albinus's honor, and, in addition to running over the discovered corpse with a cart, he chopped off the head and sent it back to Rome as a warning to anyone who dared to dream that Septimius Severus was not, in fact, the invincible and undisputed master of the world. Next time, Severus will have to deal with the consequences of his actions. A man of boundless energy, who was used to immediate and unquestioned compliance with his orders, suddenly found himself leading a civilian governmental apparatus that was sluggish, temperamental, and above all, boring. The life of a Roman politician is absolutely nothing like the life of a Roman general, a fact that Severus was quickly coming to understand. In pursuit of power, he had never stopped to contemplate whether the imperial throne would prove to be a blessing or a curse. In the end, he came down squarely on the side of the latter. With no great crises left to engage him, his spirit atrophied in the face of bureaucratic minutiae. Relief was supposed to be found in the cultivation of his sons, but before his very eyes, Caracalla and Geta were turning into cruel, petulant adolescents, and, worse yet, seemed to despise one another. Rather than being left satisfied that the power he had won for his family would be wielded wisely, he was left dejected, suspecting that the minute he was gone, the boys would tear each other and the empire apart. I say next time rather than next week, because unfortunately, I'm going to have to miss the next 2 Sundays. I'm headed up to Madison for an extended 4th of July vacation, and all my available writing time is going to be replaced with family time. But, you might say, shouldn't that mean you're only taking 1 week off? Well, yes, that's what I thought too, but then I did the math, and it turns out that between everything, this 1 week-long trip is going to knock me out for 2 full episodes worth of production time. But don't worry, I'll come back tanned, ready, and rested, and next time, we'll delve into the back end of Severus's unhappy reign and watch his adorable little boys turn into deplorable little monsters.